I'm Julianna Forlano. Hope everyone is enjoying this sweltering hot New York City day. If you're not in New York City, I hope your weather isn't too weird. Joining us today is the CEO and founder of Oximity, the global news media platform, Sanjay Goel. Also in the studio with us today, assistant professor and director of broadcast journalism, Dr. John Anderson. He has written about media policy and activism since 1997 at DIYmedia.net. He founded the first nationally syndicated labor radio news program in more than 50 years. You can find that at laborradio.org. He has a long history of organizing and working with independent media. We're going to talk about the state of independent media. What does it mean to be independent in today's media landscape? All this and taking listener calls as usual, so stay tuned. All right. Thank you for being here with us, John and Sanjay. Thanks a lot.
Oh, you're welcome. Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with Sanjay. Sanjay, can you tell us a little bit about what Oximity is and what its aim is to do? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Juliana. So our mission is actually quite simple, is to redefine the news industry in a very systemic and very fundamental way. And the problem we're trying to solve is that the news industry, as we know it, has a very, very large influence on society and helps forms people's worldviews. And unfortunately, their scope and their reach and their power has been hijacked by a lot of different vested interests. So people's worldviews are today very far removed from what I call the real reality. What people mostly see is perceived reality and what they're made to believe. So, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So what we've decided to do is basically build a very large global platform that has economies of scale and that can actually challenge mainstream media. One of the problems with indie media, the term you use, or independent media, another term you use, is that they're very, very good for their own audience. And each independent media has a very loyal following, as you do, Juliana. But
yes,
what we are missing is a critical mass of users, writers, readers, publishers, and consumers all in one place to build a voice that is larger than the voice of mainstream media. Mainstream media has a very large voice.
Do you plan on aggregating all kinds of progressive and liberal content and gaining a huge audience and then selling it to AOL like the Huffington Post did?
No. The answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no.
Now, you've been really successful in other countries. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the issues is what we call untold stories, unheard voices. So there's mainstream media, and by the way, we believe social media follows the lead of mainstream media in most cases. In some cases, the cycle has turned. But mainstream media, because of its limitations of resources, is only able to follow a very few stories in the major countries where they have easy access and where they have bureaus. That means probably 90%, 95% of the world is living in darkness as far as media spotlight is concerned.
So because they're choosing to limit their resources and I don't think MSNBC has any limitation on their resources. They're, owned by General Electric still. Is that correct, John?
No, they're part of the whole Comcast.
Oh, Comcast.
Family now.
Okay, this
Yeah.
is all. I thought NBC was a GE derivative.
No, they got sold to Vivendi, which sold them to Universal, which sold them to Comcast.
Okay, good. I'm glad you're here because
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what that comes down to is basically they still have an enormous amount of resources, so they could be covering these things if they felt that it was useful, but they, it's not really useful to them. Is that accurate, Sanjay?
I would take some objection to that. I would say that each publisher has to act within their own resources. Just because they're owned by a much larger conglomerate doesn't mean they have access to all their resources. MSNBC has to make money in their own right, and therefore they can only open so many bureaus and pay so many journalists to fly around the world and cover stories directly, and that does limit their reach. If there's a story breaking in Mali right now, I doubt if MSNBC is going to fly a journalist over to Africa and cover that story.
Oh, I see. So it's not, these aren't stories that the mainstream media is necessarily ignoring because they don't follow the narrative, but these are stories that are maybe too little to be reported. So you're aggregating content that is both hyperlocal and of national interest. Is that right? Or
That's right, and
international
actually,
interest.
and that's a good segue into the other problem that you brought up, which is also what we're solving, is that the problem of the media cycle. That basically, first of all, as we all know, the mainstream media is an echo chamber. So whatever gets covered by one publisher gets covered by everybody else. Pretty much the same story you read on all major publishers. So
And it
they're really
leads
not
to the election of President George W. Bush, right? Don't we all remember watching when Fox called the election in favor of George W. Bush? And even though all Florida wasn't clearly counted, forcing, as pointed out by documentary filmmaker Robert Greenwald and Outfoxed, that then Al Gore was coming from a man down position to try to get some justice on that front, and we all know how that turned out.
Yeah, but I mean, like John Nichols in that movie also says it wasn't a conspiracy. It was it was PAC journalism.
It was perfectly not a conspiracy.
Who can declare first, right?
Yeah, right.
And once the declaration was made, truth went out the window. That's
exactly.
That's the inherent problem with mainstream media.
It was a beautiful play. I mean, they used mainstream media's weakness, the PAC journalism, the having to be the first one to get there, as opposed to wanting to be accurate.
And then completely miscontextualize the entire court fracas that happened afterwards.
I'm sorry, I do think that it was a Fox. I'm sure Fox News called it. They're not fools over there. They have a big. They got a plan. They're not just out there. They don't just happen to be making right-wing talking points.
If John Nichols says it's not a conspiracy, it's not a conspiracy.
I don't believe
Just
John.
kidding.
Sorry, John. He's been on the show before, friend of the show, as Colbert would say. But I'm sure it wasn't a conspiracy of the major news networks. But I have a feeling that Fox News knew very well what it was doing when it called.
Self-fulfilling narrative. Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. Isn't Fox News fair and balanced? That's what they tell us they are.
You're right. I'm confused too. You're right. They're fair and balanced.
We report, you decide.
So
That's right.
Oximity has the benefit of having journalists all over the world who can report hyperlocal stories. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. So what we are building actually is, one way to think about it is a network of networks. So a network would be a very large number of readers and writers of news. We are already doing that, but what we're also doing now is connecting existing networks of independent media publishers as well as their consumers, all into one large network. And so each network can benefit from the news being generated by other networks, and each network can benefit from their news spreading all around the world. And the idea is that everything that mainstream media does in a top-down way, we're basically turning the whole pyramid upside down. So, for example, in mainstream media, the hierarchy is publisher owns basically all the assets. Then you've got an editor-in-chief or a few editors, and then you've got journalists, stringers, correspondents, et cetera. And ultimately, the final decision of the tone, the ideology, all of those things are made by Mr. Publisher, whether explicitly or implicitly. And as you know, taking America as an example, there are 6 conglomerates in America that control more than 90% of all media outlets. So the results of that is basically 6 individuals control, I hate to use this term, but control the mind, without sounding like a conspiracy theorist, of 330 million people. Mm-hmm. And if 6 people had this much power, can you imagine how the power would be used? Or misused.
Dr. Right? Anderson, would you like to chime in?
No.
He's doing great. He's got it. I know. Yeah.
So what we're saying is that we're going to take away that power and give it to who really truly owns and deserves it, which is the people, the masses. So in our system...
Oh, wow. It's a democratization of the news.
Exactly. So in our system, everything is done by our users. The news is written by the users. The agenda setting is done by the users. The fact-checking is done by the users. The prioritization is done by the users. And in the coming months, we're also going to launch a whistleblower module so that the kind of investigative journalism that some mainstream media sometimes do really well, we want that also to be democratized so people decide what should be investigated, which investigative journalists should be funded. Effectively, Mr. Publisher and Mr. Editor-in-Chief is now the masses.
So how are you going to... So news often, or at least in the past, part of the theory of news is that there is some fact-checking, there's some sort of gatekeeping function. The reason that people believe what is being said on Fox News is because it is on the television. And there's this idea that, well, it wouldn't get on all the way through all the so-called back end of fact-checking, et cetera, if it wasn't, quote unquote, true. How are you going to keep Oximity from becoming the YouTube of
right.
news?
Yeah, so that what you said is a very big systemic problem that we're trying to solve, which is what I would like to call it the illusion of objectivity, right? So because it's printed or because it's on TV or because it's on a major branded website, the assumption is that it's objective and truthful, but it's only an illusion. And I don't know if you've been following the surveys that have come out in the recent times indicate that more than half the people don't trust mainstream media. So that illusion is already withering away over time.
But the problem becomes we don't know who to trust. There's people with these great internet shows, and they're terrifying about, HAARP and earthquakes that are happening that the government is making happen. And then there's other internet shows that are talking. It's just it becomes very difficult to know when there's conflicting information coming out, who to trust.
Absolutely right. And this is where I think we are calling for a behavior change, where we're saying actually that trust nobody. What we're going to do is give you information and make sure you're aware where it's coming from. So we don't allow people to write without using their real names. Everybody who writes on Oximity has to use their real name.
Isn't that problematic in the whistleblower?
Yeah, so we will have a different technological solution for that, but that's a complex problem, which is why we haven't rolled it out yet. But we have the solution. We just haven't implemented yet. But without the whistleblower module, everybody has to write with the real name. So you cannot hide behind 20 fake Twitter accounts, for example, and publish any amount of... Can we use crap on your radio show?
Crap, yes. Anything beyond
crap,
that,
okay. No. Any amount of crap without any accountability and transparency. So that's the first
and so
step.
We can go back to the sort of shaming model, whereas if someone puts out something that is clearly, not based in fact, the rest of the community will come together and say, this is not based in fact. This person has a history of, putting things out that are not based in fact, and they would be maybe looked down upon on the computer. As opposed to, say, David Gregory, who continues to spout every friggin' Sunday, basically lies and mistruths and half-truths. I don't even want to go over what he did this last week. And he's still, on he's the head of Meet the Press, or he's the main host of Meet the Press.
Exactly. Why? Because Mr. Publisher pays his paycheck.
Yeah, because we can't shame him out of it. We try, although we try.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. That's part of the democratization. So the result of that is that basically everybody gets to write using the real name. And this is where our Silicon Valley model comes in, that in the more evolved internet companies, this is actually a solved problem. So if you look at eBay, for example, whenever you're buying, interacting with another person on eBay, you actually would go through the ratings and very quickly decide who do you want to trust and interact with and who not. So we're not saying that we're going to replicate eBay, but we're saying that this is a solved problem in basically getting people to develop a track record on Oximity, and then and other people will look upon that person based on that established track record.
And you're not going to allow sort of the Yelp review of like 2 stars.
Well, that was kind of my question. Like, this sounds like some sort of combination of like Upworthy, Reddit, and WikiLeaks.
And Yelp and Wikipedia, yes, a combination of
it is all those.
So it is kind of a combination. Okay.
It is, but nobody's actually hit the nail on the head yet. And the reason I say that is because we're after a very lofty goal. Our goal is to actually allow people to set the narrative. And we are as far away from that as we have ever been, even before the creation of the internet. Actually, if anything, I would say the problem has gotten worse with social media because the social media a lot of times acts as an amplifier of the agenda set by mainstream media.
Ooh, very interesting. Hold on. We have to take a break, and we'll come back and we will address that exact point. Stick with us, Sanjay. You can stay through the break.
Sure.
Thanks.
I got into Twitter because of the occupation of the Wisconsin State Capitol. That's my hometown. I had friends that had organized that, and I was busy in grad school in another state, and I saw people were talking about this thing called Twitter, and it turned out to be a wonderful real-time protest communication tool. And with the development of new technologies, you always see wonderful real-time protest communication tools that never make the leap to sustainability, that never make the leap to doing regular daily journalism about deep issues. And your site sounds wonderful because it taps into crowdsourcing and, all that kind of thing. But how are people making the rent?
Sanjay.
Yes, absolutely. So these are very, very, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, these are very, very important questions, and we spent a lot of time thinking about it, discussing it, debating it. So here's our view on this. When we're trying to do something entirely new, we're not going to have all the answers on day one. But there are certain principles we're operating with. And the principles are the following, that we want to democratize news. We want people who produce quality content to get paid. We believe that ultimately that money has to come from the people who are actually consuming the content. So we see ourselves as a platform that will enable content producers to make money from the platform. One of the ideas we've been bouncing around, and it's a bit far from being rolled out, but one of the ideas we've been bouncing around is that every individual will have their own profile and their own content on Oximity. And they will be able to set up a mini paywall or a mini freemium model, which means they'll be able to decide how much of their content do they want to give away for free and how much of their content do they want to lock up under some kind of a paywall and then charge users for it. So, for example,
without getting fully into the weeds, which I understand for our listeners, that you are seeking to address the idea that independent journalists and journalists who are working outside of the mainstream, have to pay the rent, but without sort of making it inaccessible to the masses. So that's what you're trying to balance. Is that right?
Yes, but I would also say, and I will be a bit provocative here, is that certain types of journalism is not going to survive at all because it can easily be replaced by models like ours. And the type of journalism I'm talking about is copy and paste journalism. If all you're doing is taking press releases or gathering information around the internet, easily available information, and repackaging it, that type of journalism is not likely to survive in the coming years. What we're going to focus on empowering is investigative journalism, high-quality journalism, where the journalist actually is really doing value add for their consumers. And that's where we believe that we will be able to empower them to not only make a livelihood, but also create value for society.
Can I ask you what value add means in a journalistic context?
I think I know what you're talking about, Sanjay, and correct me if I'm wrong here. So I live on a beach in New York City, outside of New York City, or I guess Queens is still technically New York City. Whatever.
Right.
Okay, people. So I'm able to access the shore from where I live. And recently we had an influx of a couple things. There were fishermen, and they are catching a lot of sharks. And I mean a lot of sharks, not to scare the swimmers, but because that's been gone.
Isn't it Shark Week?
It's Sharknado Week. Maybe there was some sort of PR thing where they dropped in a bunch of sharks. But they were catching a lot of sharks. And as I'm talking to the fishermen, they're saying we've never seen anything like this. There are small sharks, big sharks, whatever. And then all of a sudden that was gone. And that's the kind of news that swimmers in the area would like to know about. But it's not the kind of thing that's really going to be covered. It might be covered on, say, New York One, which is a local or it's a news channel by Time Warner Cable that's based on local news. But it's not going to be something I can go find. It's something they're going to report on Wednesday. And if I went swimming on Thursday,
It's actually funny that you say that because I would point to one of our commercial radio brethren, Sistren, on the New York City airwaves, 1010 Wins, and that would be their top story. Because they no longer cover
yes, but
big
no,
news.
the problem
if you
here,
listen to
John,
1010
the problem
Wins
here
and it
with
says,
this is that no one is reporting it
Right.
because it's not a big news story. These aren't great whites.
but-
There are a bunch of sharks that,
Sure.
that only the fishermen know
But my
about.
question is how do we do value add in the context of journalism? I agree that kind of news can be valuable, but how does it fit into the notion of building a crowdsourced platform and creating a crowdsourced editorial structure and setting up a system by which independent journalists will effectively charge users of the site they publish their content on? You know, there's a lot of burden on the content producer, which is one of the things that, you know, if you look through the history of independent media more largely, and that term itself is something that's incredibly amorphous now, it's a perennial concern. And, you know, so that's where I was going with it. Not like what type of news, because I agree, you know, the people that are going to use services like this are going to be into journalism for, you know, what like Bob McChesney calls the meat and potatoes, right? Also, I think one of the most important things is
Well, I think
context,
they'll
providing
also-
context,
I
right?
think context, but I think they'll also be in it for things that aren't necessarily getting covered, like alternative perspectives on, you know, anything that is coming out of the mainstream media. Is that
Sure.
accurate, Sanjay?
Well, yes, but I would also say that I'm actually going beyond that. What I'm actually claiming is that technology has, over the decades, right, and even centuries, disintermediated many professions.
I'm sorry. Say that.
and-
Could you repeat that again? Your mic dropped out.
Technology over the decades and centuries has disintermediated various professions. And there is a great chapter in the book by Clay Shirky, a book called Here Comes Everybody, where he talks about the profession of scribes. Before the printing press, the only way to record knowledge was by scribes. And it was a very highly regarded profession, and a lot of people got paid a lot of money doing it. Printing press came along, and the scribes, the entire profession, dug in for almost a century before they actually realized themselves that actually their profession had completely become redundant. So I'm not saying that the profession of journalism is about to become redundant. What I'm saying is large parts of the profession will become redundant. For example, the problem you mentioned, Juliana, is more a problem of getting the right information to the right people. The information is already out there. So, for example, in that shark event, some local administrative or beach authority already has this information because they probably send their people to figure out what happened, et cetera. So that information already exists. And what we are saying actually is we can disintermediate some of the supply chain of journalism by sourcing the information directly from the source, right? Now, the next question is contextualization. Even for contextualization, technology will, over time, disintermediate that process because other people are reading that news and they can actually add their version of the story to that. So I'm, again, deliberately being provocative by claiming something actually that is already happening. There's big flux right now in the whole industry of news industry. So we can't pretend that nothing is changing. We have to pretend it. We have to not pretend. We have to accept it. We have to face the reality that technology will disintermediate many large parts of the journalist profession. Some parts will remain, and one of the parts that, as I said earlier, will remain is investigative journalism, where the source does not want to reveal the information, or when a journalist has to go and dig out information which is not easily accessible or obviously existing anywhere already.
Sanjay, it seems like this is going to be a longer conversation. So the name of the site is Oximity, Oximity. It's like proximity without the PR, I believe.
That's correct.
And it's .com?
.com.
Oximity.com. You can go check out what's happening over there. Sanjay Goel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Good luck.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. You're listening to the Julianna Forlano Show.